Well, welcome to all those attending today's webinar, which is being brought to you by ICAHD UK and with co-sponsorship from ICAHD USA and the Indiana Center for Middle East Peace. This is our first webinar of 2024, and we're thrilled to have another international audience. We welcome all of you, whether you're current supporters of us or brand new to one of our webinars. We're thrilled to have you with us, and we hope that you find this a fascinating subject today. Just a couple of words about ICAHD UK. We were launched in British Parliament in 2004. And since then, we've been working hard on advocacy, awareness raising, really highlighting what ICAHD is doing, bringing it to the UK. And we have campaigns that focus on ICAHD's call for Israel to stop the demolition of Palestinian homes and structures vital for living. We get involved with holding conferences, producing resources, just really equipping people for campaigning to help end Israel's violation of international law. But ICAHD has done much more than that. ICAHD from the beginning has also looked at the big picture and the elements required for a just and sustainable peace. ICAHD now talks about ending Israel's settler colonial and apartheid policies over the Palestinian people. And in November of last year, 2023, we put out a statement calling for Israel to end its genocidal policies against the Palestinian people. So it's really important that we start this year focusing on Israel before the ICJ and asking the question, is international law still relevant? It was on the 29th of December, 2023, that South Africa brought this landmark case before the International Court of Justice, accusing Israel of committing genocide amidst its ongoing war in the Gaza Strip. Representatives from South Africa and Israel then laid out their legal arguments at The Hague on the 11th and 12th of January in hearings that were watched worldwide with great anticipation. Although it is likely that the court will take several years to reach a conclusion on the broader question of whether Israel has violated the Genocide Convention, it is expected to rule on South Africa's request for provisional measures to be put in place, including the matter of a ceasefire, now within a matter of weeks. Today, Haaretz newspaper has said that this announcement could actually come as soon as Friday of this week. So we'll see. So now I'd like to call upon our first guest speaker, who is Sahar Francis. Since 2006, Sahar Francis has been the general director of the Ramallah-based Addameer Prisoner Support and Human Rights Association. It's a Palestinian NGO providing legal and advocacy support to Palestinian political prisoners in Israeli and Palestinian prisons. An attorney by training, she joined the association in 1998, first as a human rights lawyer and then as head of the legal unit. Well, Sahar, welcome. And now it's over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Linda. Good evening, and thanks a lot for ICAHD UK for inviting me to take part in this webinar. And actually, the title, whether the international law is still relevant or not, is really a very, very difficult question. For me, at least, as a Palestinian lawyer, we're dedicating 3 decades from my life in struggling to seek justice via the different platforms of the international law, and to see, and this is really the historic moment for not just me, like for all of us as Palestinians, and I assume it should be for all the international community, about the relevance of the international law, what the ICJ will say about this case on Friday or later on, because would be really a very serious test for the whole system, whether it really works and can offer protection for victims, or it will fail the Palestinians. And with this failure, it will mean that the whole mechanism of international law on the top level is not able to protect, and is not able to work properly in order to afford justice for the Palestinian people. Because I'm sure you're already aware how much the Palestinian human rights defenders, organizations, with our colleagues and our partners all over the world, with our like other human rights organizations, with people like ICAHD. You just mentioned your role in the advocacy for decades versus the UK government, as we did exactly in the issue of the prisoners, the torture, the arbitrary detention, the detention of children. And I'm sure tens and hundreds of other organizations were trying to use the different mechanisms that we have, whether on the advocacy with diplomats and decision maker, or exhausting the UN different mechanisms via the Human Rights Council, issuing reports talking about the grave violations that the Israeli occupation committed systematically and for decades in the occupied territories. And we concluded, most of us agreed that the system is apartheid and should be called as an apartheid, and this is a colonial apartheid regime. Unfortunately, all these efforts ended up without any serious concrete measure that would be effective in making the occupation accountable for all these grave violations. We tried the universal jurisdiction procedures in the UK, in Spain, in Belgium, in other countries, in Holland. We are still trying to use it. Unfortunately, these states either changed their legal system or they dismissed the cases in order to stop the Palestinians from reaching this level of justice, seeking accountability. We were communicating with the International Criminal Court, with the prosecutor after 2014, when the Palestinian Authority accepted the jurisdiction of the ICC. And we were really looking for this body to investigate the war on Gaza in 2014 and all the grave violations committed at that time, the settlements, the other issues. More than 6 years after, there was a decision to open the investigation in the position where the previous prosecutor was still in the office. Unfortunately, since then, not much happened under Mr. Karim Khan when he took over the office. The investigation is not, we're not able to say that there is a real investigation actually taking place. And now the current genocide against Gaza is taking place, and we cannot trust that the ICC can take the serious role, because genocide and all the other war crimes and crimes against humanity that is committed are under the jurisdiction of the ICC prosecutor. So he can initiate investigation and issue warrant arrests against perpetrators, but we don't see this is happening. This is why, for us, the step that South Africa did when submitting their case in front of the ICJ were very historic, because we believe now it's really the correct moment, not just to think about what is happening since the 7th of October, because there is a history about this case. It should be taken seriously in consideration with all the practices and the policies that the occupation were imposing, and that we were expecting, because it's very important to highlight that there is another case were submitted in front of the ICJ around the legality of the occupation. The Palestinian Authority were initiating this question to be discussed legally, whether after all these years and all the grave violations on the land confiscation, the wall, the prisoners and the torture and all the related issues, house demolitions, and all the other policies that the occupation is systematically implementing, it should be discussed whether this is legal according to the international humanitarian law and the human rights law or not. And so far, there was no discussion on this case. There's no ruling. This is why the current case becomes very, very important and very serious case, because it will be the first step, actually, in order to continue discussing the status of this regime after all these 75 years. I hope that we really will reach this level where the ICJ will discuss the occupation itself and all the other related practices as an outcome of the colonial apartheid regime that was imposed on the Palestinian people since 1948. And this would bring the answers, the correct answers for what's the responsibility of the international community. This is another layer that is very important and would be very effective for us, even if we end up just with the provisional decision on Friday or later. I mean, we as organizations, as lawyers, as activists, we can take such decision and do a lot with it in our advocacy, because this will mean there is responsibilities on third states, like on the genocide convention. There is a very serious responsibility for the other states to not allow the genocide, not to be complicit with genocide, and to give remedies. And this is very important, because I think what we are facing today as well is the fact that, unfortunately, lots of European countries, including the UK, is not just supporting verbally the genocidal actions in Gaza, but in some cases they're supporting by arms. They're giving other supports to the Israeli government, which makes them responsible and complicit in these actions. So the decision of the ICJ would be very relevant for these countries to stop immediately and to abide to the decision of the ICJ. And this is, for us, would be a very important step toward seeking accountability for all what we were facing all these decades. It's not just gonna be around what's going on, the horrible things in the current attack against Gaza, but if the discussion would be really around other policies that the occupation were implemented. So for us as a Damir, it would be very important, the discussion over the whole military system. This is the system that we were always describing as an apartheid system, apartheid legal systems that imposed on the occupied people, with the administrative detention policy, the arbitrary detention. Currently, the administrative detainees number increased under the current war to be more than 3,300 people that they are sitting without any trial in the Israeli prisons based on secret information, including children. By the way, thousands of people were arrested since the 7th of October, more than 6,000 people. Already we had 5,000 prisoners from Gaza are forcibly disappearing. The Israeli authorities are not disclosing any information around those who are arrested from Gaza and are under the definition of illegal. They're like using the illegal competent law. I know it's the time is limited, but I wanted to end up that I think it's really very important development on the legal level on the question whether really as Palestinians we can use and benefit from these international standards, or again we will face hypocrisy and double standards and we wouldn't be seeing justice done with the Palestinians. I hope that the international human rights and humanitarian law and the legal system will prove that it can work, because otherwise this will undermine, I think, the whole international order. And this is not the kind of world that we want to live in.
Exactly. Thank you. Thank you, Sahar. We do not want to live in a world that does not respect the international law and the order that that brings. Thank you. We're now going to move from Ramallah to Jerusalem. And I'd like to call upon Jeff Helper to please speak next. Jeff is the co-founder and director of the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions, founded in 1997. Jeff comes with a doctorate in anthropology. He's taught at universities in Israel, Central America, and the United States, where he was the head of the Friends World College, which has an international university program. Jeff is the recipient of several Peace Awards, and he was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. He's authored several books, and the latest is this one, Decolonizing Israel, Liberating Palestine, Zionism, Settler Colonialism, and the Case for One Democratic State. So Jeff, yes, he's also on the steering committee for the Palestinian-led One Democratic State campaign. So that's Jeff's background. And now will you say a few words addressing our theme today, Israel before the ICJ, and is international law relevant? Thank you, Jeff.
Okay, thank you, Linda. And thanks for having me. And thanks to Sahar and Bob for joining. I'm not an international lawyer by any means. I'm simply an anthropologist. And in some ways, it would be better if Bob had followed Sahar as an international lawyer. But I think the logic was to hear a Palestinian and then hear an Israeli and then get a bigger picture from Bob, which also makes some sense. So I'm coming at this more as an Israeli and how Israel sees this, but also as a political activist. And for me, of course, the question of is international humanitarian law relevant is certainly an important question in terms of the actual political struggle that we're involved with, that Sahar has talked about very eloquently. First of all, of course, for Israel, international law really plays no role whatsoever. In fact, Israel, and I write about this in another book called War Against the People, Israel is really pioneering a new kind of state, but in many ways, the new kind of world order that's based on security. Israel's model for every country in the world basically is what we could call a security state. And that is, Israel is saying to the world, look, you can have any kind of system you want to, democracy, dictatorship, Islamic rule, theocratic rule, whatever you want, that doesn't matter. But first and foremost has to be security. Security trumps everything, because without security, of course, all these other, political mechanisms and political structures are really kind of irrelevant. And this, of course, is really falling on listening ears in the world. And I think in a way, we have to begin almost by asking ourselves, not only is international law still relevant, but in many ways are war crimes and crimes against humanity and genocide actually becoming the norm of international society, rather than what we would expect as international law develops, as young people get involved politically, as these outrageous things happen, like the Israeli assault on Gaza, that there'd be more and more awareness of the need for international law, for a just world order. And actually, the hands, let's say, of the progressive people would be strengthened. But in fact, the opposite seems to be happening. And there's a very interesting article by William Robinson. I put it up on the chat if anybody wants to look at it, where he and I also, in my book War Against the People, really put this in some ways in the context of global capitalism, which seems to be maybe a very far-fetched kind of a thing, but we have to really talk about the political economy of genocide. In other words, as the world begins to shut down, on the one hand, the rich get richer, and since the capitalist system has really exploited almost every market possible, it has nowhere else to expand. It's beginning to implode within. And we see the income disparities. We see that 80% or more of humanity lives on less than $10 a day. You have tremendous disparities between the Gates of the world, the Bill Gates of the world, and the vast majority of actually what we would call surplus humanity. In other words, it isn't only the people who are poor, but they're excluded from the system. They'll never be educated, the vast majority of the world's population. They'll never really have job skills. They'll never get out of the informal economy where most of the workers of the world are. And worse, in a capitalist system, they'll never be consumers. And so what you're having is more and more of humanity becoming surplus humanity, as fewer and fewer people are monopolizing the resources. The capital and resources are flowing into a few countries of the global north. And in fact, this is happening in the global north as well, where your own children in the UK are being excluded from the job market. Our own children don't have the expectation of having our standard of living at all. And so what I'm saying in this, because I have to be very brief, is that in this kind of a system, the whole issue of the insecurity of the rich, the breakdown of social fabric, as society ceased to function in a normal sort of a way, and the increase then the needed increase in repression on the part of state authorities becomes greater and greater. And if we, in fact, adopt this Israeli idea that security trumps everything, and we can see that in our own lives, and we go to the airport, nobody has to ask us to take off our shoes or take our computer out of the case. We do that. We've internalized that already. So security, in a sense, is becoming, I would say, in many ways, the replacement of the idea of international law as the guiding principle of society today. And in that kind of a situation, Israel not only can thumb its nose at international law, but in many ways, Israel is rewarded, because based on its 100 years of controlling and repressing the Palestinian people, it's developed a repertoire, an arsenal of weaponry, of surveillance techniques, of technologies of repression of people, of policing, that has given it a niche in this global system. So on the one hand, it's the enforcer of global capitalism because it's able to deal with wars against the people. But on the other hand, it also supplies repressive regimes. So that we have to really ask ourselves, not only, again, is international law relevant, but is it losing out and in a way, Sahar is really right. This ICJ decision is so important because, at least from a layman's point of view, it's so clear that this is a genocide situation. And not only that, as Linda sort of hinted in our statement against the genocide against the Palestinian people, we say not only is it Gaza that rises to the level of genocide, but if you take the entire 75, 76 years of Israel's destruction of the Palestinian people and the displacement of the taking the land and so on, that certainly rises to the level of genocide. So if in fact the ICJ rules against South Africa, that really is, and for Israel in a sense, and don't forget the United States, Canada, Germany, and other powerful countries, France, are supporting the Israeli case. This really gives us an indication of where the values and where the principles are. So my question would be to Sahar and later on to Bob is in a world then in which international law maybe has less traction than we would hope, and as avenues of redress for oppressed populations like the Palestinians close down. In other words, they're all there on paper. You have the UN, you have the Security Council, you have the ICJ, you have the ICC, you have Geneva Conventions, you have tribunals. The conventions themselves contain mechanisms of accountability. In other words, even though it's there on paper, if this world of the whole structure of international law, plus the content of it, does not give oppressed peoples avenues of redress, then where do they go? And that's why I think, on the one hand, we're very involved in a political struggle. I'll end on this thing. In some ways, it even worries me a little bit that many young Palestinian activists are talking about what we call the human rights approach to dealing with the Palestinian issue. And you see this a lot on Shabaka and other Palestinian social media. People are beginning to say, well, we don't care. 1 state, 2 states, 10 states, just give us our human rights, you see? And that's putting all your eggs into an international law basket that we're questioning whether that basket has a bottom at all, whether it can really deliver. So this is also a strategically important question for Palestinians. Because if, in fact, international law and avenues of redress are not available to the Palestinians, then where do they go strategically in order to continue their struggle for their own liberation? So those are some of my thoughts. I guess the question I would have at the very end is, if Sahar and Bob believe that there is a chance to salvage international law and strengthen that structure, how would we do that as civil society? What has to be done to strengthen the system? Or should we begin to think that maybe we have to move on and develop alternative forms of struggle?
Wow. Thank you, Jeff. Thanks for those thoughts. And again, very much looking at the big picture, what's happening globally, as well as what's happening in Gaza and the West Bank and for Palestinians. within all of historic Palestine. Okay, we are now going to move on to hear from Robert Herbst. Bob, as I will refer to now, is the co-chair of ICAHD USA, and he has been a lawyer for 50 years, specializing in civil rights, whistleblower protection, employment and housing discrimination cases, criminal law, and class actions in the federal and state courts. Bob has served as an independent investigator and prosecutor for the International Criminal Tribunals of Sierra Leone and Rwanda. So, Bob, it's wonderful to have you with us today, and now it's over to you, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Linda. It's great to be on this panel with Sahar and Jeff. Although with the bleak picture that Jeff has presented, it's hard to know what to say, and I'm sure we'll get into that in a bit. But I'm coming at this as an American Jewish civil rights lawyer. And I have to say, preliminarily, I am utterly heartbroken at what I've seen the last 3 months. I am grieving for 30,000 dead Gazans at the hands of an Israeli government that purports to act in the name of all Jews, of which I am one. I do not accept the notion that Israel represents me or all Jews. But it is hard to argue with polls that show that Israel's genocidal acts have widespread support among Israeli Jews, upwards of 90%, and majority support among American Jews. So I fear that we are witnessing the approaching summit of the moral self-immolation of the Jewish people, committing genocide within the lifetime of Jews victimized by the German genocide of the 1940s. And I am concerned that no matter what happens in the international courts or the American courts, where there is a case of genocide, complicity of genocide against President Biden and Secretary of State Blinken and Secretary of Defense Austin, that the Jewish people will carry the kind of stain or tarnish that the Germans have carried ever since the Second World War, where even today they feel they have to confront how their nation, their people, their forebears could descend to the depths of genocide, the crime of all international crimes, and apologize for it. So the question that we're asked is international law relevant to all of this? And I say the answer is yes, because ultimately that is all we have, and that's all we're going to have if we have a future. I think the context is that we're all engaged in a great struggle within each of us and in the world at large between tribalism and altruism, as the late, great evolutionary biologist E.O. Wilson has taught us. It's the struggle between our instinctual drives to other those who are not like us, whether it's racial, religious, ethnic, national groups, which he labels tribalism, and on the other hand, to see ourselves as a member of one global human species or family, which is his definition of altruism. And if we are going to see and govern ourselves as one global humanity, and Wilson says our survival as a species depends on it, and frankly, we see all around us that we can't solve our problems like climate change and war and peace and weapons of mass destruction without it, we have to ground that governing in law and not raw power. So I say again, international law is all we have to do that. And what the victorious powers did at Nuremberg and the principles they enunciated for the world while they created the flawed United Nations and set out the great charters of human rights, of which the Genocide Convention is a significant part, that will raise the critical question, which of course is still subject to debate, as Jeff says, as Sahar says. Were we punishing the Nazis because we won the war, won the power game, or because they had actually violated fundamental principles by committing crimes against humanity, a principle that we are going to abide by? And of course, we don't know the answer to that question yet. But I'm betting on the proposition that these great charters of international law not only mean something, but they set out the course by which humanity can and will govern itself. The US and Israel and their Jewish communities, I'm sorry to say, have sorely tested that proposition. We have accumulated money and power greatly disproportionate to our numbers. We have exercised that power to provide impunity to Israel in its subjugation of the Palestinians. Now that Israel has proceeded to genocide, these things must be said because they are true. We all helped create in Israel an apartheid state, which Archbishop Tutu called worse than the South African variety, despite the fact that apartheid is a recognized crime against humanity. It's punishable under international law. That was bad enough, but in the last 3 months, we have become genociders and those complicit in genocide. And for anyone who doubts that's what we're doing in Gaza, that it's genocide, that what Biden and his administration have done in unleashing Israel is complicity in genocide, a separate crime under the convention, you just have to read the papers in these two blockbuster cases that are now going on. The South African case in the International Court of Justice, the ICJ, and how appropriate it is that South Africa is the one bringing the case. And the case that I mentioned before against Biden, Blinken, and Austin in a federal court in California, accusing them of complicity in genocide. The legal papers in these cases are brilliant. They're horrifying, but they're brilliant in the way that the case on the merits of genocide have been assembled by the lawyers. And the background of these cases is that there's a well-developed body of international law that's been created in the last 30 years on genocide, not only by the ICJ, but by the international criminal tribunals of Yugoslavia and Rwanda in cases like Bosnia, Croatia, and Myanmar. And the precedents these courts have established include the following legal principles. One, there are no circumstances, not armed conflict, not the exercise of the right of self-defense, that can ever justify genocide. Yet this was the primary defense Israel gave at the ICJ for anybody who watched it, a right to defend itself against Hamas. Even if Israel were not considered an occupying force, occupying forces have no right of self-defense, the right of self-defense would not provide any defense to genocidal acts committed with genocidal intent. That's the main reason why Israel should lose if the ICJ follows these precedents. Second principle is, in addition to killings, the physical or biological destruction of a substantial part of a national, ethnic, or racial group may include forcible displacement or transfer, conducted in such a way that the group can no longer reconstitute itself, not merely as a temporary displacements for safety, but as a critical step in achieving the ultimate objective of the attack, to eliminate them as a substantial part of such group. And we know from the leaked Israeli intelligence, the original plan was to transfer all of the Palestinians out of Gaza to Egypt. The indiscriminate bombing has utterly laid waste to Gaza to make it unlivable so that they would flee south and be unable to return. That's genocide. Acts of genocide also include those that deliberately inflict on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about physical destruction in whole or in part. Deprivation of food, medical care, shelter, clothing, systematic expulsion from homes, contamination of water. That's genocide. And for everybody who's aware of what's going on in Gaza, it's clear that this is all happening. Genocide may be committed against only a significant enough portion of a group to have an impact on the group as a whole. So the group targeted may be limited to a certain geographic area, and in times of armed conflict may also include military personnel belonging to a protected group because of the membership in that group. Here we know that Gaza's 2.3 million people represent a significant portion of the 5.5 million Palestinians under occupation by Israel, and that qualifies as genocide. Intent to commit genocide may be inferred from circumstances including the overall systematic nature and scale of the attacks against the same group and the dehumanizing narratives and rhetoric in officials' public statements. Now here, the dehumanizing statements of Israeli political and military officials from Netanyahu on down have been nauseating and clear evidence of genocidal intent. So invoking the total destruction of the Amalek by the Israelites, President Herzog saying we'll break the backbone of the entire nation out there that's responsible, the defense minister saying we are fighting human animals and will act accordingly by imposing a complete siege on Gaza, no electricity, no food, no water, no fuel, and so forth. The evidence of genocidal intent is overwhelming. By the way, the US intervened in the ICJ in the genocide case brought by Ukraine against Russia. And ironically, the US took the position that all contracting parties have the obligation to prevent genocide at the instant the state learns of, or should normally have learned of, the existence of a serious risk that genocide will be committed. Yet the White House and State Department admitted earlier this month that the government hasn't even bothered to make a formal assessment of whether Israel's conduct implicates the convention. But it issued an assessment of Russian war crimes within a month after the Ukraine invasion. So they know, Biden and Blinken must know that's genocide, and they're closing their eyes to it deliberately and to their complicity in it. And this is why civil rights lawyers here have brought their federal case against them, and why South Africa's next genocide case is going to be against the United States and the United Kingdom, by the way, for complicity in genocide. So what has happened here is, frankly, that the international lawyers who've worked in these international courts to establish these principles, they see genocide happening in Gaza in full view of a world not doing anything about it because the US has paralyzed the Security Council with its veto. And these lawyers have decided to lay out the genocide case for everybody to see and to present this challenge. Are these principles, descending from Nuremberg, in which we have applied to Africans, Eastern Europeans, Asians, are they also applicable to the Jewish state and its American protector and its West European supporters? In a world where power rules without law, life is nasty, brutish, and short, as it is now for Israel's Palestinian victims in Gaza, and starting now to be so in the West Bank. So, like, I don't know how the case in the ICJ is going to come out. Politics still has great influence on the courts, as we know. Here in the United States, we know it full well. We just look at our own United States Supreme Court. But this is genocide. And the merits of the charge is clear. So if that crime goes not just unpunished, but not called out, the efforts to govern ourselves as one human species will sustain a terrible blow. We can't order ourselves by power alone. All we have is law. So we all have a huge stake in the outcome of these cases, and we owe an enormous debt of gratitude to the lawyers who have brought them. I look forward to further discussions of this with you and any questions anybody has about any of this.
Thanks, Bob. Again, really powerful. And do you know, there's lawyers, not only, you mentioned the lawyers in the United States bringing a case against Biden and your government there for complicity in war crimes. It's happened in the UK already and in some other European countries. So my goodness, yes, there's all kinds of mobilization that is going on now, which is really come off of what South Africa has done. Let's take a few minutes 10 minutes for Jeff, Sahar, and Bob to just make some comments amongst themselves before we open up questions from the audience. So Jeff and Sahar, can you unmute, please? And over to you.
Jeff, you're muted.
You're fine, Sahar.
Oh, you begin. I'd like to defer in general to Sahar and Bob because they're the lawyers.
Well, I've just spoken. So Sahar, why don't you start?
First, allow me to thank both of you, Jeff and Bob. It was really an honor to share today with you and to hear your analysis. So I think your question, Jeff, about where we go, like if the ICJ rules against South Africa in this, I think this is a very serious, like it would be very frustrating because exactly, I totally agree with Bob. I believe and I wanted to continue to believe that all what we have is the law as the tool, but to be implemented on equal ways on everyone in our world, not in double standards, not based on the power that you have. So if we fail in this case, I would lose hope a bit. And means that we need to restructure the international order, definitely. I mean, we, the people. I think should be a very serious, important step for the social movements, the grassroots movements, the all activists around the world to think about how we can joint efforts to change, to cause for a change for this international order. It can't be that the United States keep the hegemony over the Security Council and undermine each and every initiative to stop the genocide in the ways that were constructed to be used in these cases. Why, after the Second World War, they invented this system and I mean, this is really very, and this is what caused the failure of seeking justice for all these years, the power and the manipulation of the power and the use of the political power in the legal process that we tried as Palestinians, whether on the universal jurisdiction level in the UK, in Holland, in Spain, all the cases that we lost, that we couldn't brought perpetrators for justice because of political motivations. States were still protecting the Israeli perpetrators over torture, over settlements, over the attack on Gaza, on the war in 2014, and so on. So,
Oh, sorry. No, go ahead.
yeah, no, please go ahead.
Well, I want to offer a couple of observations. Number one, the South African case has already had an enormous impact, in my view. First of all, Israel had to, because it is a signatory to the convention and a UN member, it had to appear in the court to defend itself. That's the first time that I can think of that Israel has appeared in an international courtroom to defend its conduct. And the case that it presented was so weak that the word really went out for the first time that, wow, Israel's committing genocide. I think it's had an enormous impact, and I think a lot depends on if South Africa loses, how they lose. They could lose on jurisdictional and procedural grounds as opposed to on the merits. And if that happens, I think the impact of the loss would be much less, obviously, than if there was a rejection of the case and a rejection of provisional measures on the merits. So I'm, it's a terribly tough battle to get law to trump power for all the reasons that Jeff mentioned. But ultimately, that's the struggle for humanity. If we can't win that battle, I don't think we're going to survive, very honestly. I think we're all going to kill ourselves.
Sahar, finish your thought and respond, okay?
No, I'm really grateful for Pope, and I want to keep this optimism that because it's really about our humanity, and I want to believe that yes, we will save our humanity, because I don't want to think about the other scenario, and this is why I still believe we have things to do and we have things to continue putting efforts on. No matter what the decision would be on Friday, we should continue. Like our belief that we have the power at the end of the day as people to face all these capitalist, imperialist strategies, because the surveillance, the security techniques that you described, Jeff, that Israel is distributing everywhere and gaining profits from all these surveillance technology, Pegasus and other software programs, we have the power to boycott and to issue cases, legal cases in different countries, to join efforts to raise awareness with the people, to struggle against and to fight against these big companies that controlling our lives.
I just have one short thought before we go on to the questions, and that is that, thinking as a political person rather than a legal person, I've written in my books about what I call global Palestine. Palestine is much more than simply a local issue. It's almost a microcosm of all these issues that we're talking about that have global implications. And in many ways, we could look at this case at the ICJ as this test case in a sense. Will international law prevail in what Bob is saying is clearly a case of genocide, or where the political powers have their day with all that with all that implies. So I think that one thing, if in fact the ICJ does not issue the provisional measure, at least about a ceasefire, and finally at the end of the process over years, this issue of genocide, it would seem to me that one thing we might do as ICAHD, and together maybe with other organizations and legal people, is to really create a campaign around Gaza and around this issue of Israel's getting away with genocide, not only as a protest against what's happening in Gaza and with the Palestinians, but in a sense as a warning to the larger world community about this. In other words, to use this to parley it as more of a global issue, and in that sense, because I don't think the issues that we're talking about, is international law relevant? That's not talked about very often. International law is sort of the province of people like you guys, the legal people. It hasn't really become that much of a public issue. But if we can show through this Gaza issue what Bob was really saying, that it's either international law and a just social order or collapse in a sense. And if we can show how the political powers that be are trying to frustrate international law for their own interests, that I think would be a very powerful campaign. In other words, to bring international law more into the focus of the mainstream and make it an issue in a way that it really. Today you talk about Palestine, you talk about all the issues of Palestine, but the legal issues are still not in the forefront as they should be. And maybe we can use this ICJ case as a way of getting those issues of international law out.
Well, let me. I just want to say that I think the apartheid reports that started being published 3 years ago gave us an organizing technique or an organizing mechanism that wasn't present when we were talking about occupation or settler colonialism, because apartheid was a crime against, it's an international crime. And so it was amenable to legal process. And now with genocide, that's in spades. So I think that now lawyers have a much greater role to play and greater possibilities now in the struggle. And I also think we have to keep our focus like a laser, despite the fact that there's global Palestine, on Palestinians in Gaza who are being killed by the thousands, because right now there are about 1,000 a week being killed by bombs and bullets, but there are 5,000 a week who are now starting to die of starvation and illness because there are no medical facilities. There's no way to treat someone who's seriously wounded. So you know, we need to keep the focus on that, and you know what to say.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to open up for a few questions now. Several have been submitted into the chat line, and we may not have an opportunity to get through all of them. I want to select some that are very much to do with the ICJ, the ICC. We'll go on from there. I also want to mention that we will be scheduling another webinar about genocide and the ICJ after we get the statement as to whether it will move on to some preventive, preliminary measures. Then we will have more guidance. But to bring a little bit more clarity, now, if we could start with, I'll throw out a few questions here. What is the difference between the ICJ and the ICC? So people are clear on that. What are the prospects that the Security Council will support a ceasefire? So again, very legal. And does it really take years for full judgment of the ICJ to come to its conclusion as to whether or not this is genocide? So those are three more specific questions on the whole court system. Bob and Sahar, if you want to bring that clarity.
Okay. Well, to take the last question first, yes, it will take years to get to the merits of the case, but the brilliance of seeking provisional measures is that there is this procedure for preliminary relief, and the standard of what you have to show is much more lenient. You don't have to prove genocide. You have to prove that the acts involved sort of are capable of falling within the rubric of genocide. So it's there is a reasonable chance that the ICJ will announce some measures. And by the way, the difference between the ICJ and the ICC, the International Criminal Court, is that the ICJ resolves disputes among states. So this is not a criminal proceeding against an individual. This is a dispute brought to it by South Africa, who claims that it has a legal dispute about whether genocide is going on with the state of Israel.
Bob, can I interrupt for 1 second to ask you, sharpen a question that was asked? If, in fact, the ICJ issues a provisional measure or an order for a ceasefire, which it has the authority to do, that has to go to the Security Council, doesn't it, for
Yeah,
approval?
because like
And
the
then
US,
it's subject to the veto, right?
yes, so like the Supreme Court in the United States, it has no enforcement mechanism on its own. And so it does have to go to the Security Council, which is empowered to enforce. It's about the Security Council is actually required to enforce the judgments of the ICJ and give them effect. So if the United States vetoes that, I'm not entirely convinced it will. I think the chances are substantial that it might, but I'm not convinced that it will. But if it does, it's rejecting the holding of the court and telling people that it's not going to permit the United Nations to carry its role.
Sorry, Bob, isn't the Genocide Convention force orga omnis, like, which means we don't really need the Security Council approval. States should abide by the decision not to be complicit or supporting genocide.
Yes, and under international humanitarian law, genocide has its own existence apart from the Genocide Convention. And it is the kind of peremptory norm that is required to be enforced by all the nations of the world. So that is true. But then the question is finding a nation that is willing to entertain it in its own courts. And then what are those courts enabled to do, in practical terms? What could it do? I don't know, maybe it could enforce a boycott of Israel or sanctions or divestment. But obviously the easiest way to
have to be approved by the Security Council. There you get into political waters now.
Well,
the United States could accept the decision, but not approve sanctions. It depends what the judgment is. If the judgment of the court is the preliminary judgment that for example, the Israelis must start a ceasefire and must withdraw its troops. Really, the only body that can enforce that would be the Security Council. And the question is, are they going to pass a resolution that says Israel has to do that? And then if Israel doesn't do that, then to devise a series of measures to compel Israel to do it. But that's more political than legal. In other words, the United States could veto that without, under the rubric of security.
Yeah, but I mean, this would be helpful on the ICC process, because then we could request the prosecutor in the ICC to issue warrant arrests against political leaders in the state of Israel. We can initiate cases against the UK, Holland, Germany, other countries that they're supporting the US, definitely weapons to Israel. There is a way how to activate kind of this provisional decision, not just through the Security Council, I think.
Yeah, and just to follow up on that, the ICC prosecutor, who's relatively new, as Sahar mentioned in her presentation, has been quite tardy in pursuing allegations of misconduct by Israel. But he has a staff of lawyers in the office of the prosecutor, of which a number are are upset about what they believe constitutes genocide, and so I'm predicting or hoping, I don't want to predict, but I'm hoping that we are going to see something positive come out of the ICC. The problem with the
He also
ICC.
visited, by the way, the border, at the border of Egypt. He also visited, in a sense, the Gaza front. So he has been personally engaged.
Yeah. The problem with the ICC is that any of their investigations take a long time. You know, the evidence has to be gathered, witnesses have to be gathered. Of course, the South Africans and the Americans who prosecuted these two cases, bringing these two cases, have put a lot of that evidence together. So, you know, so maybe the ICC could outdo itself in terms of expedition, but you know, that remains to be seen.
Okay, thanks. Thanks. I'm just going to throw out a couple of other questions very quickly for a brief response from you, speakers. One is, I think this one is very much for Jeff. What hope is there that Israelis will remove Netanyahu and his right-wing government? Jeff, do you want to just answer that directly, very quickly?
He will be removed. I mean, it's clear. There's already talk, even in the middle of the war, about new elections. He's hated. He's gone. But that's not going to change the complexion of the Israeli government. I mean, the next guy coming in is Benny Gantz, who is himself genocidal. When he was running for office in the last election, for his own party, he has his own party. He had a video, and he opened his campaign by bragging that I killed 4,000 terrorists in Gaza. So Gantz is in some ways, as a military person, even more genocidal than Netanyahu. He's more moderate. He speaks better. He's not as outwardly shady as Netanyahu is as a politician. But nevertheless, he even if the government changes, Israel's policies will not change either politically or militarily.
If I may add just one sentence, Benny Gantz designated the 7 Palestinian organizations, including Al-Damir, as terrorist organizations.
Yeah. Wow. Wow. Yes. So he's not good news at all.
In other words, they were saying, just to, that, I mean, this is really what they said, that terrorism isn't just violence or, terrorism is they have this concept, judicial terrorism, advocacy terrorism. In other words, what Al-Damir and Al-Haq and the other groups were doing that had nothing to do with fighting in any sense, in a physical sense, is for Israel terrorism. So, I mean, that's really shows and maybe we should make this point too, that Israel is very, very influential in manipulating international law. It has this concept of lawfare. It has institutes, and it's working very strongly to really get international law formed in a way, again, around the security issue. Rather than in terms of justice and human rights and things like that. And I think what Sahar mentioned, what Gantz did with these 6 or 7 human rights organizations really shows the degree to which Israel's trying to expand this concept of terrorism to legal organizations.
Yeah. And Jeff, you've got a new article that's just come out today in Counterpunch that we'll have to get circulated, which is about state terrorism versus...
Yeah, problem of redress.
Okay. So we'll go into that. I just want to ask this question. What is Hamas's position now in recognizing the existence of Israel? Because in 2017, Hamas announced it would accept a Palestinian state in the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza. Has it changed its position, or is that still its formal position? And then my last question to be answered now is, for comments about Hamas then being tried at some point for war crimes. That would be within the ICC, right? So if we could have clarity on those 2 points, and then I'll ask for the final statements from our speakers before I give announcements, please. So the questions on Hamas.
Sahar, maybe.
Well,
Do you
Hamas,
know?
yeah,
I must
Hamas
say,
is not
I
a
don't
state.
know what's
Well,
the.
Hamas is not a state, so it can't be, Israel can't bring a case against it for war crimes or genocide in the International Court of Justice, but it could bring an allegation, a case, or ask the prosecutor of the ICC, the International Criminal Court, to pursue it.
Okay, so that's been answered. And does anybody know?
No, Sahar, I think Sahar wanted to.
Yeah, Sahar, do you know?
On the political position, I think, again, it doesn't matter because you can do an agreement, like if they request a Palestinian state to be recognized on the UN, based on the UN resolutions on the 67 borders, it doesn't mean they have to recognize the state of Israel or like accept the existence of Israel as a Jewish state. I don't think these things contradicting each other, but I don't see it relevant now. On the question of the responsibility, yes, I agree with Bob. The prosecutor in the International Criminal Court can initiate investigation, but this is the very important thing, that we need an objective investigation to investigate all what happened, all war crimes, all crimes against humanity, but not just around the 7th of October or after the 7th of October, the whole, like all what was happening. And this is very important to highlight, that it's not about recognizing a Palestinian state and that's it, we would be satisfied as Palestinians. No, we want to see justice, which means the perpetrators should pay the price for the grave and the serious violations for the war crimes and crimes against humanity and the genocide and the aggression and all grave violations that were committed for decades.
Excellent. Thank you for leaving us with your thoughts, Sahar. Now, Bob, please, a final comment or comment? You said before you're positive. Is that what you want to leave with us?
Yeah, I don't consider myself an optimist, and I really don't know how the struggle is going to turn out. I mean, we have these existential crises that beset us, and we don't have a global political organization capable of dealing with them, and we don't even have a consensus that we need a global political organization with executive, legislative, and judicial powers to deal with them. So I find it hard to be optimistic with that kind of situation. But for those of us who are committed to the rule of law, it's a constant struggle. We in the United States have had a written Bill of Rights since our inception, and frankly, it's a struggle in every generation to vindicate those rights and to keep the Bill of Rights and the other provisions of the Constitution, front and center. So it's a struggle that we all have, and our children will have, and God willing, our grandchildren will have if they're still around. And there's nothing that's more worthwhile than that kind of struggle. So that's, in terms of optimism, pessimism, that's how it works. That's where I stand.
Thanks, Bob.
Thank
Jeff,
you.
Yeah, thank you, Jeff. Very briefly.
Okay, well, when we ask the question, is international law, especially international humanitarian law, relevant? I think the answer, I agree with Bob, the answer is certainly. the issue is not the law itself, and not the even the structures on paper, like tribunals and the different courts and all of that. It's the weak enforcement regime. The fact that these laws and rulings cannot be implemented because international law has not yet, I think, achieved the power position that it can trump politics and political considerations. And like Bob said, you even see that in the ICJ, you know, where the judges are appointed by countries. Israel has its judge, you know, on the ICJ and so on. So the problem really is this issue of weak enforcement, because there's a international lawyer that you guys might know named Ben Saul, S-A-U-L, Saul, who wrote a very interesting article called Defending Terrorism. And what he is really saying as an international lawyer is that if there is no redress for oppressed peoples, in other words, if it's all on paper, but in fact there's a weak or non-existent regime of enforcement, then in a sense, you know, terrorism can get to a point where, and this is his phrase, it can be illegal but justified. In other words, this issue of redress is super important, not only for the justice itself to be done, but to prevent you know, the collapse of our system, where terrorism becomes almost the only way oppressed peoples and marginalized peoples, surplus communities, can survive even in this system. And so, you know, like Bob is saying, you know, without this system of international law and the regime of enforcement, it is a pretty bleak future that we're facing.
Well, thank you. Yes, perhaps we will know very soon. If it's not this Friday, certainly within the next few weeks, we'll have an idea, you know, from the ICJ as to whether these provisional measures will be taken that will allow us to have another discussion and carry on. Sorry for the people who submitted questions that we didn't have time to get around to in this webinar, but hopefully the next one will give you that opportunity, because then we will be looking, I guess, more at what comes next in terms of Palestine, statehood, even Israel as well.
Linda, I just want to make one announcement.
Okay, yeah.
In the California case against Biden, Blinken, and Austin, the federal judge is going to have a hearing, and it's going to be live streamed on Friday, just in case the ICJ disappoints us and doesn't come out with a ruling. You can hear the argument on the motion to dismiss that case and the motion for preliminary relief that the plaintiffs have made, if anybody is interested. It should be quite educational, and it's 12 o'clock Eastern time, which is, I think, 5 o'clock UK time, if I'm not mistaken, and 7 o'clock
in Jerusalem,
in Israel and Palestine.
You'll get that wide publicity, that
it's going to, anybody can tune into the court's website and watch it. It's the Northern District of California, and the name of the I can't remember the name of the judge, but the case is called Defense of Children International versus Biden. So if you just put that in, you'll
interrupt for a second? I'm sorry. Yeah, the Center for Constitutional Rights, if you go to their website, they are streaming it, I believe, on their YouTube page. And I can send you the actual document. Bob, it's Abigail. That would possibly give you the information for streaming.
That would be great, because then we can circulate it.
Okay.
So thank you very much. And I do want to just say we've got a couple of slides to show you now. And the first one is about staying in touch with us, learn more about our work. ICAHD UK sends actions you can take. We send them out as bulletins mid-month. At the end of the month, we send newsletters with articles and other news. You
And
can
Bob,
see,
by the way, is the co-director of ICAHD USA.
that's right.
So
Yeah,
don't forget
we
that.
we did say that, and it's very important here on this slide. We do focus on ICAHD. When you go to ICAHD, you will find ICAHD USA as well as ICAHD UK. And we've got here the address for the Indiana Center for Middle East Peace, the other co-sponsor of today's webinar. And all of us as organizations have a lot of information and programs and actions. So do stay in touch with us. Okay, and the next slide is specifically for ICAHD UK. It's about joining us in the UK. We are a membership organization, and here we set out that we work to enhance ICAHD's influence and communications with supporters, the media, politicians, and key influencers. We are campaigning now. We're focusing very much more than ever on settler colonialism, genocide, and apartheid policies against the Palestinian people. We still retain our focus on home demolitions and displacement, and then we work for this political change in support of the One Democratic State campaign led by Palestinians. So we are very much about equipping you for this long struggle that we're in, which Bob was referring to as well. So please join us. You go to the websites, the information is there. And yeah, so we have another webinar, which is going to be on the 21st of February. It's going to be at the slightly later time of 6 p.m. in the evening. And the focus for that is on Palestinian mental health and Israelis, the effort to just debilitate Palestinian society. And speaking will be professionals from the field of mental health. So those working, on the ground in the West Bank, in East Jerusalem, in Gaza. And we will also have supporting voices from the UK Palestine Mental Health Network. So that information is on our website as well. So there's lots going on, lots we offer. Please, please stay in touch with all of us. I want to thank you all again for coming, especially Sarah Frances, Sahar, and Bob Herbst, Robert Herbst, speaking from the United States, and Jeff Helper, speaking from Jerusalem, and all of you who have joined us. Thank you so much for your time. We appreciate it. See you again soon, and goodbye.
Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, thanks for having us.